How could I have known that would happen? Would it completely change my life? It started out like a typical day till I entered that space. As I managed to observation of the door ajar and an eerie A feeling awoke inside of me in an instantaneous. I had the option to back off, set it away. However, I decided not to, as in exact moment of realization, I realized that everything would be different. From then on. Yes, I do bear the accountability in this case, because I was the one who started the process of events and was unable to stop it. George was real. Are you at your home? Work? The house was still. However, I could hear faint noises wafting down from the top floor. Elliot discovered within the walls of his chamber. At first, it didn't seem important to me. A brief example of a young man, a wander in the depths of his personal creativity. Maybe he would want a coffee cup. A quick conversation could turn out to be enjoyable. Going up the stairway, I tried to identify where the enigmatic sounds were coming from all around me. When I got to his room, I noticed that the door was a little open. I took a deep breath, ready to call forth him. But then I looked at Elliot. He sat with his laptop laying on his bed, the bright screen shining on his lap, face that glows softly. He has his hands in motion, and at first I thought he was simply enthralled with something exciting, possibly an exciting action movie. However, as I changed my position, changing my viewpoint, a surge of strength swept past me. At that moment, clarity swept over me, and I realized that's exactly what Elliot was doing. The screen's reflection caught my look, and a chilling wave swept through me. I was surprised by this. This wasn't something I had wanted to see. Elliot scrambled quickly, trying to get back his calmness while he made the necessary adjustments the laptop's volume. However, the moment had passed. The occasion had arrived and depart. As we looked at each other, his face began to flush. There was obvious discomfort in his eyes. He whispered, "Apologies," his eyes floating somewhere else. I discovered who I was, motionless, as though time had stopped halt. Is it the door?" I asked. Started, but I was completely disoriented. In the core of what I'm saying, I felt a strange feeling. I was overcome with embarrassment. However, my enigmatic thoughts swept like a tempest, and just out of reach, I quickly left the room with my heart pounding inside of me. My chest, my palms were pressing against my face, trying to establish a cadence in my take a breath. What was that? I whispered quietly to myself. What had I just finished? What had prompted me to such negligence? Was I really the only one? Who is at fault in this case? Stop, Darlene, this. I reprimanded myself firmly. However, the conflict within of me was spurred by factors other than just what my eyes had seen. Elliot arrived at 23 years old. He had outgrown his early life. However, I was a lady at 47 who had carried the burden of humiliation all the way through my existence. I had never before found myself in such a situation. However, the feeling of embarrassment was too familiar. I stayed still in the corridor. My heart is thumping frantically in my chest. My fingers brushed through my hair. I was trying to gather myself. As when Elliot entered the room, he played with his shirt collar, cleared his throat, and looked away. "I'm sorry, Darlene. I thought I had," he whispered. "Shut the door." His voice hesitant but sincere. I quickly avoided my eyes, shook my head in refusal. I have to admit, I should be the one to extend I'm sorry. Should have knocked. Prior to entering, I quickly said, groping for words I couldn't find. Silence. However, this quiet was not like any other. We had been sharing the same residence. However, this instance was for the first time. Our eyes locked in a significant manner. It was the initial example of a situation when tension loomed between us. I should go downstairs now and start getting dinner ready, I said, quickly turning to face the staircase. Although my voice wavered, I tried not to lose my temper. Elliot said nothing. He just followed my every move with his eyes, as if he were trying to put together pieces of a puzzle in his mind. Prior to the noteworthy occurrences between Elliot and myself, don't forget to activate my channel and subscribe, alerts, and keep an eye out for the whole story. I promise you, there will be a surge of excitement soon. Going up. Until that night, there was a pause between us, without a word separating us. Quietness reigns, without any messages, looks, or even the slightest interaction of politeness. However, that quiet, it said that nothing would ever come back to how it was. Over dinner, we sat at the same table, yet our gazes stayed apart from each other. The one sound reverberated across the atmosphere, a exquisite silverware clinking at a meeting. Our plates surfaced. It was necessary for us to communicate with reduce the tension that lingered in the air. Both of us knew it, but the question persisted. How? The evening faded away, and then the arrival of one more day, and then one more trailed behind it. Everything seemed to be like it ought to. However, underneath the surface, nothing was as it appeared. The silence between us only intensified the invisible strain that pervaded the atmosphere. On what appeared to be a typical afternoon, Elliot sat down next to me. His gaze revealed a glimmer of doubt. However, the desire to repair what was damaged was evident, plainly through. Darlene, in reference to the other day's events, I find I felt a great deal of embarrassment. I'm sorry. I never hoped for conditions to develop in this way. It is my honest wish that this doesn't endanger our partnership, he said. His voice was shaky but sincere. I took a deep breath and centered myself. No matter how odd and this circumstance was unexpected, it was necessary for me to calm him down. Smiled a little and made a tiny shrug, saying, "Oh, Elliot, have faith me. I've had my fair share of embarrassing incidents during the years later." I then described a number of those moments to him. He nodded, and his smile softened, the blush of humiliation slightly lessening. At that moment, it seemed as if the weight of the dangling tension between us had at last faded. However, at the superficial level, I knew nothing had actually happened. In spite of the tremendous progress in our conditions, this discussion had completely removed the obstacles that once kept us apart, and I could feel it profoundly. The circumstances were precarious, of reaching hitherto unheard of heights. Elliot laughed quietly, his eyes float toward the table. "I guess we're even now," he whispered. I scowled subtly and turned my head in his direction. "Could you elaborate on what you mean?" I asked with a tinge of interest, lacing my voice. For a brief instant, his face changed as though he had simply come to the disturbing conclusion that he'd spoken something he could never retract. His hand rubbed the back of his neck, halting for a brief second. However, he had started already, and he discovered he forced himself to continue. He took a big breath and looked away. He said in a whisper, "I've seen you." Much like that, you just weren't conscious of it. An electrical shock rushed through my body. I remained motionless, captured in a brief instance of silence. When I whispered, "What is this?" sensing how heavy his words were descending on me. The cheeks of Elliot color burned, but he persisted, not deterred. I didn't tell anyone, weighed down by guilt. However, it stayed deeply imprinted on my mind. Actually, I kept it a secret, a notion that stayed with me for a long time. The heart pounded with passion. Strange warmth surrounded me, the unknown sensation that told me in a whisper that there was a change. What Elliot said went beyond simple admission. They were broken, tearing down each last obstacle that divided us. I looked at him. His eyes were fixed on me too. Now, we both keenly understood that this was not merely speaking to each other. The mood had become crowded in the space. A profound change had occurred. From that point on, everything changed. There had always been a gap in the past between us, the invisible separation that kept us apart. However, it appeared now that that border had completely disintegrated. Not knowing that me, I discovered that I was devoting a longer period of time to Elliot, small-scale incidents, discussions that seem insignificant. However, in reality, each instance only made the stress worse. That was between us. We discovered ourselves seated next to each other, engrossed in the film industry together. We kept a certain distance in the past from one another. However, an unspoken, there was a lingering attraction between us, a feeling that we both experienced, but decided to keep silent. Occasionally, as on the couch, Elliot's arm was resting idly, and I touched his leg, or when the air was filled with laughing, and a strange feeling awoke inside me. However, I tried to shove it away from my mind. Sleep on a restless night escaped me. Uncomfortably, I turned and twisted under the sheets. However, my inner agony would not be quieted. Maybe there is only one thing on my mind. This just can't go on, Elliot. I deemed it essential to create a limit. If he had any affections, I had to make it plain to myself and put a stop to it. Having said that, with a lingering thought, I got up from the bed. My heart pounded, out of control. However, my feet had already taken me to Elliot's chamber. The door was standing, a container, letting a gentle light leak out. Entered the darkened chamber. Once inside, I looked at him. He was lying in go to sleep. However, at that moment, my eyes wasn't fastened to him. They were captivated by something monumental, something different. My breath caught. My body turned into momentarily motionless. Seeing him in a tempest was released within that state. Me, I was never intended for it, to observe. At that time, I should have turned around without thinking, but I didn't. I stayed in that moment, battling the feelings circling inside of me. At that time, I quickly withdrew inside of me, a power agitated, one that I found difficult to control. However, I decided to ignore it. I walked back to my chamber and leaned back. However, everything felt changed forever. That evening, I stayed blissfully oblivious to the complex turns that were waiting for me. No, despite my best efforts, I discovered myself unable of ignoring the growing connection with Elliot. As time passed, the lines between us diminished even more, and our sense of attraction grew stronger with each moment. I didn't realize how profound I had stepped into this predicament. However, there was only one obvious truth. The retreat was slipping out of my hands. Then that was how Elliot went home. He was drunk, the door clattering, the things he tampered with. The noise rang true. Someone has woken up George. However, I could relate to George's struggles. Every morning to get out of his sleep. I quickly left my room and headed to Elliot. Prior to realizing it, I discovered I was standing directly beside him, with I hardly had time to change my clothing. With a faint smile, Elliot's eyes strayed, dancing at his mouth's corners. "Darlene, do you truly exist?" he said, whispered quietly. He blurted out, intensified by the alcohol's cloud. However, stays sincere. I took a big breath and grabbed his arm. "Leave it, Elliot. It is not allowed to go up the stairs in this way. Quietness is necessary." But Elliot's eyes stared at my face. A soft smile came to his face, his eyes slowly moving throughout my body. "It's very evident that you have a certain superior. Stunning. Have you always possessed this quality? Or did I just forgot about it?" I took a time, but quickly recovered my calmness. That will do, Elliot. Enter the kitchen, and I'll make for you a cup of coffee. I led him with thoughtful attention to the kitchen, tried to reorient him to reality. However, Elliot's intense gaze and his comments gushing out of his mouth led to a mess inside of me as well. Elliot sat down in the chair while I worked. I had coffee with myself, but in and suddenly, the cup fell away from his hand, spilling its contents all over across the counter. Well, Elliot, you have to be more careful, I said hurriedly, trying to clean up the mess, but Elliot just grinned subtly. Have, have you always been so sweet? I quickly cleaned the kitchen. We were unable to stay here any longer. George laid sleeping upstairs, but Elliot in such a state, he was aware that he had to please stop making any more noise. Okay, we'll go up to the higher floor. However, I warned, now be quiet, putting my arm around his while guiding him in the direction of the stairs. After going into his space, it was clear that his movements had become more shaky. He discovered that he desperately needed a change of attire, but he was also confused to handle things on their own. At first, I wanted to back off. However, after observing his battle with the garment, I was under pressure to assist. As my fingers touched the Elliot's breath and the buttons of his shirt turned into a calm murmur. At that moment, the air crackled with the weight of our unspoken words. The tension was increased by the silence. Was well aware of what I was doing, but strangely enough, I was in a condition of complete bewilderment. Elliot's eyes maintained a fresh ferocity as it descended upon me. This was among those situations, one of those were the moments we could never get back. Elliot hesitated, seized by a flash of he was uncertain as he dressed, letting his hands fall to his sides, looking directly at me. In that, I realized for a moment that my breath had increased quickly. Silence fell. The space, the oppressively heavy air, making every breath a painful chore. I'm done with this game, Darlene, he said, declared in a soft voice at first, but full of conviction. I looked at him, my unblinking, uncompromising eyes. My heart pounded fiercely. What was Elliot trying to say? You, he continued, adopting a deeper resonance. Consequently, we were only able to glimpse each other that one time. Time, and that's the only thing to do. You really don't think about it? Remains in your mind as you're drifting into sleep. A chill went through my body, which made me take a cautious step back. Yet my feet were still there, obstinately fixed to the earth. This isn't right. Elliot, I demanded. Despite my trembling voice, Elliot's smile was understated, but it contained a trace of nothing benign at all. We crossed the cutoff point for figuring out what is long ago. Darlene stopped the self-deception. He took a step forward and another. He was now so close that I could feel the pressure of his breath against. He raised his hand and his fingertips on my flesh, lightly grazing my cheek, found it impossible to look away, despite the desire to do so, since below the surface, I realized that he was, yes, at that very moment, Elliot's lips. The silence pressed against my envelopes. There's a noticeable tension in the air. In that brief moment, there was the answer to everything. The noise of ideas suddenly whirling around in my head fell silent, all of my doubts fading into hushed tones because I had failed to defend myself against Elliot. Sincerely, the urge had never been mine. Although my hands trembled, I stayed unwavering, declining to retreat. After seeing the ferocious determination in Elliot's eyes, I understood that every secret had been revealed. Took a big breath, my heart pounding, as I relaxed my garment's straps softly down my back. You're correct, Elliot, I said in a barely audible whisper, lifting a breath. Now is the moment to put a conclusion to this charade. As I shut the space between us completely, I leaned back, on the bed, and my heart pounded in my chest, but backing up was no longer a potential. Elliot leaned slowly his body in my direction. He looked into my eyes for a brief instant, then extended, "Do not fear," he added with a smile, a voice full of warmth and comfort. "Everything is as it should be." I looked around, a shiver running through my body, yet I was unable to bring myself to admit it. In my heart, I was painfully conscious of how long my excitement for this occasion. However, I tried, but the words slipped out of my lips wildly. "Elliot," I confessed. My breathing became labored, and I felt afraid, creeping in as a result of several important. "My breath matters, Elliot," I admitted, hitching, a feeling of discomfort sweeping over me because of certain important issues. Elliot dismissed what I had said with a smirk, like they made him happy. Maybe it was because he was drunk. Elliot came near, speaking in a barely audible, "George must not wake up," I whispered, realized what he meant. Quietness was indispensable. "I am at a loss." A great energy rushed through me, forcing me to suppress any noise that Elliot looked at me as he threatened to flee. He said, "Darlene, I understand. Everything is yes, and you are as well." What was that? Did he get it? He appears to have recognized my thoughts and understood who I am. I gave in to the moment, unable to resist. I let my eyelids to close, seized the linens with an angry ferocity as my entire body trembled and frantically convulsed. I pressed putting my hands to my mouth and suppressing any sound that was on the verge of being released. Elliot was sufficiently drunk to apathy, unaware of the outside world surrounding him. In reality, this was having a profound effect on me. The excitement of the event was entwined with all that encompassed it, and the alluring feeling of something enormous. Elliot discovered himself drunk, exhausted, and unable to breathe air. I yelled, "Elliot, this flushed, and we need to act fast." "All right," Elliot said in response. "All right." Nevertheless, he went on that, repeating the same route indefinitely. I felt another contraction come on, and in nothing else mattered at that moment. Had completely forgotten my identity, so I closed my eyes and mumbled, "Anything you want, Elliot. Anything you want." It must have pleased Elliot because he gave himself up entirely, released all of his grip, which demonstrated to be too much. The intensity inside was too much for me. I carefully put tucking Elliot into his bed snugly. I then fastened the door to his bedroom, where I longed for a calm shower, a chance to relax and release the burdens of the day. Uncertainty threatened over me, keeping me wondering about what was going to happen next, what had just occurred. As I stood beneath the tumbling river, my thoughts strayed to the ideas that troubled me, igniting a feeling of uneasiness and anxiety inside me. However, as I came out, newly discovered my thoughts became clear. Oddly enough, I was surrounded by a feeling of peace. I discovered it. It's impossible to be angry with myself, because my body and mind were at peace. In silence, I dressed and walked to the bed and gave in to sleep, as if everything had stayed unaltered. However, the truth is that this was only a brief instance of excitement, a rush of uncontrollable desire. But simplicity was ephemeral. What about this? This was not an illusion, and destined to stay simple, too. This was not the end of the journey. Point. It was not feasible. More significant occurrences, things that are more intense, came to light. In the end, George was bound to find the whole truth. The story is far from finished. Please be sure to follow and sign up to receive updates on the events that are about to happen. Activate alerts and express your opinions in the comments, which keeps you ahead of the game in creating these stories. Your assistance is priceless. I appreciate you staying. Accompany me on this adventure.